Billionaire Marries, an ugly maid for revenge, but on the wedding night, he was shocked by what he discovered. Alexander Blackwood was the kind of man who made the world stop. A billionaire, charming, with a gaze that could freeze the sun. He was admired by many but loved by few. And to be honest, he didn't care. Alexander lived in a world of numbers and contracts, where emotions were a weak currency. But everything changed that afternoon when he uncovered a secret that made his blood boil. It was just another Wednesday. The sun was shining outside, but inside Alexander's office, the atmosphere was ice cold. He sat in his leather chair, eyes fixed on a photo on his desk. It was an image of Victor Lane, his greatest rival. Victor, with his fake smile and empty promises, had just stolen a multi-million-dollar contract from Alexander. And now, to make matters worse, Alexander discovered that Victor was in love with a woman, a mere employee, an ordinary woman, plain-looking, named Emma. Alexander let out a low chuckle. "Emma," he whispered, as if the name itself were a joke. He couldn't understand how someone like Victor could be interested in a woman like her. But then, an idea started forming in his mind. A cruel idea, filled with vengeance and wounded pride. He decided he would marry Emma, not for love, of course, but to humiliate Victor, to show the world that he, Alexander Blackwood, could have anything he wanted, even the woman Victor loved. The next day, Alexander went to the small cafe where Emma worked. She was there, serving tables with a shy smile and eyes that seemed to hold 1,000 stories. Alexander watched her for a moment, studying every detail. She wasn't beautiful, at least not in the traditional sense. Her hair was plain, her face free of makeup, and her clothes modest. But there was something about her, something he couldn't quite define. He approached her with a confident smile. "Emma, right?" he said, extending his hand. She looked at him, surprised, but accepted the handshake. "Yes, and you are?" she asked hesitantly. "Alexander Blackwood," he replied, a glint in his eyes. "And I have a proposal for you." Emma frowned, confused. "A proposal?" Alexander smiled. "Yes, I want to marry you." She laughed, thinking it was a joke. But when she saw the seriousness in his eyes, her face went pale. Why me?" she asked, unable to understand. Alexander shrugged. "Because you're different, and I like different." Emma hesitated. She knew there was something strange about his proposal, but she also knew her life was far from a fairy tale. Working at the cafe barely covered the bills, and she dreamed of something more, something bigger. So, with a deep breath, she agreed. "All right," she said, looking into Alexander's eyes. "I accept." The wedding was set for 2 weeks later. Alexander made sure it was a grand event, with hundreds of guests and all the extravagance his money could buy. Victor Lane was invited. Of course, Alexander wanted him to witness every moment. He wanted him to feel the pain of humiliation. On the wedding day, Emma looked beautiful. She wore a simple but elegant dress, and her hair was styled delicately. Alexander looked at her with a cold smile. "Ready?" he asked, extending his hand. She nodded, but there was something in her eyes he couldn't quite decipher, something that made him uneasy. The ceremony was quick. Vows were exchanged, rings were placed, and within minutes, Alexander and Emma were married. Victor Lane stood at the back of the room, his expression unreadable. Alexander smiled at him, feeling a wave of satisfaction. He had won. But that night, when they were alone in the luxurious hotel suite, everything changed. Alexander spoke first, his tone filled with disdain. "You know why I married you, don't you?" he said, looking at Emma. She didn't answer. She just stared at him with a calm expression. It was to humiliate Victor, to show him that I can have anything I want. Emma smiled, but it wasn't a smile of happiness. It was something else, something unsettling. I know, she said calmly. Alexander frowned. What do you mean by that? Emma stepped closer, her gaze making his heart race. You think you're the only one with secrets, Alexander? She asked, her voice soft but firm. I'm not who you think I am. A chill ran down Alexander's spine. What are you saying? He asked, trying to stay composed. Emma reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. These are all your illegal transactions, your corruption schemes, your darkest secrets, she said, placing the envelope on the table. I was hired to destroy you, Alexander, and now you're in my hands. He stared at her, shocked. Who hired you? He asked, his voice trembling. Emma smiled again. That's for you to find out. But for now, just know the game is over, and you're no longer in control. Alexander felt the ground vanish beneath him. He looked at Emma, trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong. But deep down, he knew this was just the beginning of a story that would change his life forever. Alexander and Emma's wedding was the most talked about event in the city. Everyone wanted to know how a billionaire like him had ended up marrying such an ordinary woman. Speculation ran wild, but no one could have imagined the truth behind that union. As guests toasted and laughed, Alexander maintained a cold smile, knowing that every moment was a dagger to Victor Lane's ego. Emma, on the other hand, seemed calm. She moved through the ballroom with a gentle smile, greeting guests as if she were the happiest bride in the world. But every now and then, her eyes met Alexander's, and there was something in them he couldn't decipher. It was as if she was playing a game whose rules only she knew. Victor Lane was there, of course. He stood in the corner of the room, watching everything with a dark expression. Alexander made sure to walk past him multiple times, always with a victorious smirk. Enjoying the wedding, Victor? He asked, his tone dripping with provocation. Victor simply stared at him, saying nothing. But there was something in his gaze that made Alexander feel uneasy. That night, after everyone had left, Alexander and Emma were finally alone in their luxurious hotel suite. He looked at her, expecting to see fear or submission. But instead, he saw a woman who was confident, almost defiant. So he began sarcastically, "Now that we're married, what exactly do you hope to gain from this?" Emma sat on the bed, calmly crossing her legs. "Gain," she repeated with an ironic smile. "Alexander, you still don't get it, do you? I'm not here to gain anything. I'm here to destroy you." He laughed, but it was a nervous laugh. "Destroy me? You really think you can destroy me?" She reached into her bag and pulled out a small recorder. "Everything you said today, all your confessions, are right here," she said, pressing play. Alexander's voice filled the room, revealing his illegal dealings and darkest secrets. His face went pale. "How did you?" he started, but Emma cut him off. "I'm good at what I do, Alexander, and you severely underestimated the woman you chose to marry." A wave of anger and fear surged through him. He stepped closer, trying to intimidate her. "You won't get away with this," he said, his voice shaking with rage. Emma simply smiled. "Oh, Alexander, you still don't understand. I've already won, and now you're going to do exactly what I tell you to." He stared at her, feeling the ground disappear beneath his feet. Emma wasn't just some ordinary employee. She was a spy, a woman with a plan. And Alexander, the man who had always been in control, was now completely at her mercy. Alexander stood frozen in the middle of the room, staring at Emma as if she were a ghost. He The man who had always been in control now felt like a fish out of water. "What do you want?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady but failing miserably. Emma rose from the bed, walking toward him with a calmness that made him even more nervous. "What do I want?" she repeated, her smile never reaching her eyes. "I want you to understand something. You're no longer the most powerful man in the room. From now on, you do what I say when I say it. And if you even think about betraying me—" She paused dramatically, holding up the recorder in front of his face. "Everyone will know exactly who you are." Alexander felt his blood boil. He wanted to scream, curse, throw something against the wall. But deep down, he knew he couldn't. Emma had him in the palm of her hand, and he needed to think fast. "Fine," he said, swallowing his pride. "What do you want me to do?" Emma smiled, satisfied. "First, you're going to cancel the contract with Victor Lane's company. Second, you're going to donate half of your fortune to charity. And third—" She paused, locking eyes with him. "You're going to tell me everything you know about the organization behind your business." He frowned, confused. "Organization? What organization?" Emma sighed, as if she were dealing with a stubborn child. "Don't play dumb, Alexander. I know you work for them, and I know they're far more dangerous than you think." A chill ran down Alexander's spine. He knew exactly who she was talking about. A secret, powerful group that controlled much of the city's illegal dealings. He never wanted to get involved with them, but he had no choice. And now, Emma was asking him to betray them. "Are you insane?" he said, his voice shaking. "They'll kill me." Emma shrugged, as if that wasn't her problem. "Well, then, you have a tough choice to make, don't you? Either you help me, or I destroy your life. The decision is yours." Alexander stared at her, a mix of rage and desperation swirling inside him. He had nowhere to run. In the end, he gave in. "Fine," he said with a heavy sigh. "I'll do what you ask. But know this, Emma, if I find out you're playing me, I swear I will destroy you." She smiled, as if she had expected that response all along. "I'd love to see you try." The next morning, Alexander woke up with a pounding headache. He turned to the side and saw Emma sleeping peacefully, as if nothing had happened. A wave of rage surged through him, but he knew he couldn't do anything. At least, not yet. He needed a plan, and fast. While Emma slept, Alexander grabbed his phone and started making calls. He canceled the contract with Victor Lane's company, just as Emma had demanded, but he made sure to leave a coded message for his closest contacts. He wasn't going to sit back and watch his life crumble without a fight. When Emma woke up, she looked pleased. "Good boy," she said with a smirk. "Now, let's talk about the organization." Alexander sat up in bed, watching her with suspicion. "What exactly do you want to know?" he asked, trying to buy time. Emma crossed her arms, studying him like a science experiment. "Everything. Who are they? What do they want? And why are you working for them?" Alexander sighed, knowing he had no choice. "They're powerful. They control everything, from arms trafficking to the financial market. I never wanted to get involved, but they forced me." Emma tilted her head, as if assessing the truth in his words. "And why did they force you?" she asked, curiosity lacing her tone. Alexander looked down, his throat tightening. "Because I had something they wanted, something I couldn't give them." Emma was silent for a moment, processing his words. "And what was that?" she finally asked. Alexander looked at her, his eyes filled with pain. "My sister. They kidnapped my sister and said they'd only release her if I worked for them." Emma's expression flickered with surprise, but she tried not to show it. "And where is your sister now?" she asked, her voice softer. Alexander closed his eyes, the weight of the memory pressing down on him. She's dead. They killed her. Even after I did everything they asked. Emma was silent, as if reconsidering something. Alexander, she started, but he cut her off. No, don't try to be sympathetic now. You want to destroy the organization? Then let's destroy it. But know this. I won't stop until every single one of them pays for what they did. Emma stared at him, seeing the raw determination in his eyes. She knew he meant every word, and for the first time, she started to wonder if she was on the right side. Alexander and Emma spent the next few days planning their next move. He knew the organization wouldn't just disappear, and Emma had information that could be useful. But despite working together, the distrust between them was palpable. Alexander couldn't forget that Emma had infiltrated his life to destroy him, and she didn't fully trust him either. One night, while reviewing documents in his office, Emma broke the silence. Alexander, have you thought about how we're going to prove all this to the authorities? She asked, looking at him seriously. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. It won't be easy. The organization has influence everywhere. Even in the police. Emma tilted her head, thoughtful. Then we need something bigger. Something even they can't ignore. Alexander looked at her, intrigued. Like what? She smiled, a spark in her eyes he hadn't seen before. Like a live confession. Something that can't be edited or distorted. Alexander was surprised. You're talking about a live broadcast? That's insane. Emma shrugged. Maybe, but it's the only way to make sure the truth comes out. And if we do it right, we can catch them off guard. He was silent for a moment, considering the idea. It was risky, but it was also their only chance. All right, he finally said. But how do we do it without them stopping us first? Emma smiled, as if she had already thought it through. We need a safe place. Somewhere they won't find us. Alexander thought for a moment, then had an idea. I have a place, a house in the middle of nowhere, far from everything. No one knows I own it. Emma nodded, satisfied. Perfect. We leave tomorrow. The next day, they left before dawn. The drive was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. Alexander couldn't stop wondering if he was doing the right thing. And Emma, well, she seemed more determined than ever. When they arrived at the house, Alexander was surprised to see it looked exactly as he had left it. It was a simple but cozy place, far from the luxury and extravagance he was used to. Emma looked around with a slight smile. It's nice, she said, sounding surprised. Alexander looked at her, feeling a strange connection in that moment. They were in an impossible situation, but somehow he was starting to trust her, or at least believe that for now she was on his side. In the safe house, Alexander and Emma began working on their plan. They set up a small makeshift studio with cameras and equipment that Alexander had secretly brought. As Emma adjusted the settings, he watched her, trying to understand what motivated her. Why are you doing this? He asked, breaking the silence. She stopped what she was doing and looked at him with a serious expression. Because I believe it's the right thing to do, she replied calmly. I've seen what this organization does to people, and I can't just stand by and do nothing. Alexander remained silent for a moment, considering her words. He knew she was right, but he still found it difficult to fully trust her. And what do you get out of this? He asked with a hint of suspicion. Emma sighed, as if tired of explaining. I'm not doing this for money or fame, Alexander. I'm doing this because I believe people deserve to know the truth. And maybe because I also have a past I'm not proud of. He was intrigued. What do you mean? She looked down, as if struggling with her own memories. I used to work for them. I was one of the people who helped keep the system running. But one day, I saw what they really were, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. Alexander was surprised. He hadn't expected her to have such a deep connection to the organization. "So, you're trying to redeem yourself?" he asked in a softer tone. She nodded, her gaze filled with determination. "Yes, and I know this won't erase what I've done, but it's a start." They sat in silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. Alexander began to see Emma differently. She wasn't just a spy or an enemy. She was someone trying to do the right thing, just like him. In the end, they went back to work, but now with a new understanding between them. Alexander knew there was still much to be done, but for the first time, he felt he wasn't alone. And maybe that was enough to face what was coming. Everything seemed to be going well until one night, Alexander received an anonymous message on his phone. It was a photo of Emma sitting in a cafe with Victor Lane. The caption read, "Do you really think you can trust her?" Alexander felt a knot in his stomach. He looked at Emma, who was sleeping on the couch, and began to question everything. The next day, he decided to confront her. "Where were you last night?" he asked, his tone accusatory. Emma looked at him, confused. "I was here with you." "Why?" Alexander showed her the photo on his phone, and Emma's face turned pale. This isn't what it looks like," she said, trying to explain. "Then what is it?" he asked, his voice full of anger. Emma sighed, knowing she could no longer hide the truth. "Victor found me. He knows we're working together and offered me a deal. He said he would leave me alone if I helped him destroy you." Alexander felt a wave of betrayal. "And did you accept?" he asked, his voice filled with despair. Emma looked at him, tears in her eyes. "I didn't accept, Alexander. I refused, but he threatened to kill me if I didn't cooperate." He remained silent for a moment, trying to process everything. "Why didn't you tell me?" he finally asked, his tone softer. Emma looked down, feeling ashamed. "Because I didn't want you to worry. I thought I could handle it on my own." Alexander felt a mix of anger and relief. He knew Emma was in a difficult situation, but he also knew he could no longer trust her completely. "We need to end this. Emma, we need to expose the organization before it's too late." She nodded, her eyes full of determination. "I know, and I'll help you, Alexander. But we have to do this together. No secrets, no lies." He looked at her, feeling a strange connection. Maybe, despite everything, they could still trust each other. With Victor Lane's betrayal revealed, Alexander and Emma knew they couldn't afford to waste any more time. They decided to accelerate their plans and scheduled the live broadcast for that very night. As they prepared the equipment, the atmosphere between them was tense but determined. They both knew it was now or never. Alexander took responsibility for connecting the devices and ensuring the signal wouldn't be traced. Meanwhile, Emma prepared a powerful speech detailing the organization's crimes and how they had manipulated innocent lives. She knew she had to be convincing, as this would be their only chance to expose the truth. When everything was ready, they sat together, facing the camera. Emma took a deep breath and began to speak. "My name is Emma, and this is a message for everyone watching. The organization that controls much of the illegal business in this city must be stopped. And today, we will expose the truth." Alexander followed, sharing his own experiences and how he was forced to work for the organization. He talked about his sister, the threats, and the fear that consumed him. It was an emotional moment, and he felt a weight lifted from his shoulders. However, in the middle of the broadcast, the lights began to flicker. Alexander looked at Emma, worried. "They're here," he whispered, his voice filled with fear. Emma nodded, staying calm. "We have to continue. We can't stop now." They kept speaking, but soon they heard footsteps approaching. The door to the room was broken down, and several armed men entered. Victor Lane was at the front, a cruel smile on his face. "Did you really think you could escape us?" he said with a mocking tone. "Alexander," and Emma stood up, ready to fight. "You're not going to stop us, Victor," Emma said, her voice steady. "The truth has already been exposed." Victor laughed, as if it didn't matter. "The truth? The truth is, you're alone, and no one will believe two desperate people." But before he could do anything, sirens began blaring outside. The police had arrived, alerted by the live broadcast. Victor looked at Alexander and Emma with a look of hatred. "This isn't over," he said before fleeing with his men. Alexander and Emma stood in silence, looking at each other. They knew the fight was far from over, but for the first time, they felt they had a chance. And maybe that would be enough. With the police searching the house and Victor Lane nowhere to be found, Alexander and Emma knew they needed to act quickly. They couldn't rely on the authorities to handle everything on their own. While the officers were asking questions, the two exchanged meaningful glances. It was time to take control of the situation. Alexander approached the lead detective, a middle-aged man with a tired look. "We need to talk to you," he said with an urgent tone. The detective raised an eyebrow, but agreed to listen. Emma handed over a USB drive containing all the evidence they had collected. "Here's everything you need to arrest Victor Lane and the organization," she said, her voice firm. The detective looked at the USB drive, then at them. "Is this serious?" he asked with a tone of doubt. Alexander nodded. "Very serious. And if you don't act fast, they'll disappear." The detective was silent for a moment, but finally agreed to take the case seriously. Meanwhile, Victor Lane was in a hideout, furious. He knew his network of power was collapsing, and he wasn't going to let Alexander and Emma escape without consequences. He called his remaining contacts, ordering them to find the two at any cost. "I want them alive," he said, his voice cold. "They will pay for this." Alexander and Emma, in turn, were hiding out in a cheap motel far from the city. They knew Victor wouldn't give up so easily, but they also knew they couldn't stop now. "We need to make sure all the evidence gets into the right hands," Emma said, looking at Alexander. "And we need to protect ourselves." He agreed, but there was something in his gaze that concerned her. "Alexander, what are you thinking?" she asked with a cautious tone. He looked at her, determination in his eyes. "I'm thinking we need to end this once and for all. We can't keep running forever." Emma was silent for a moment, but eventually nodded. "All right, but we need to do this together. No secrets, no lies." He looked at her, feeling a strange connection. Maybe, despite everything, they could still trust each other. Alexander and Emma knew the final confrontation with Victor Lane was inevitable. They had gathered all the evidence, alerted the authorities, and done everything they could to prepare. But deep down, they knew the real battle would be personal. Victor wasn't going to give up without a fight. That night, they met with Victor in an abandoned warehouse. The atmosphere was heavy, and the silence was almost palpable. Victor was there, surrounded by his henchmen, a cruel smile on his face. "Did you think you could escape?" he said, his tone mocking. Alexander looked at him, determination in his eyes. "It's over, Victor. We exposed the truth. There's nowhere left to run." Victor laughed, as if it didn't matter. The truth is that you're alone, and no one will believe two desperate people." But before he could do anything, Sirens started wailing from outside. The police had arrived, tipped off by the live broadcast. Victor looked at Alexander and Emma, a look of hatred in his eyes. "This isn't over," he said before fleeing with his men. Alexander and Emma stood in silence, looking at each other. They knew the fight was far from over, but for the first time, they felt they had a chance. And maybe that was enough. In the end, Victor was arrested and the organization was dismantled. Alexander and Emma were hailed as heroes, but they knew the real victory was surviving. They had faced the worst and come out stronger. Alexander reflected on everything that had happened. He realized that pride and revenge almost destroyed him, but he also learned that forgiveness and love could heal even the deepest wounds. "True wealth isn't in money," he said, looking at Emma. "It's in human connections and the ability to change for the better." Emma agreed, emphasizing that everyone deserves a second chance. "Love and compassion can overcome even the greatest mistakes," she said with a smile. "And in the end, that's what really matters.